Hello, welcome everyone to what is the last P Talk of the academic year. So what we've got is we've got an amazing guest for you. You've got Dr. Jo Hale from UCL, who the Ps, who, if you don't know, are the psychologists for environmental action group at Durham University, have welcomed to come and give a talk about behaviour change and sustainability and all things behavioural science and climate change, basically. So the format of the talk is that first, Dr. Jo Hale will give a short presentation, a talk about some research and their ideas and a very interesting model around behaviour change and sustainability. Then we will open it up to questions. If you come up with questions during the talk, you feel free to write them in the chat at any time. Otherwise, you can hold on to them until the end, and then you can write them in the chat then if you want me to ask the questions on your behalf, or you can raise your hand and I will happily throw to you to answer or to ask the question yourself. And Jo will be fielding questions after the end of the talk. As I said again, in case you're new and you've just arrived, we are recording this session, so be aware of that. And on that note, I'm going to throw over to Jo Hale to take over. Oh, wait, hang on. Give me 1 second to pin you to the screen. Right, there we go. Hi.
Thanks very much, Jo. Thanks for the kind introduction. Just bear with me a moment while I share my screen with you all. Okay. I hope you can all see that clearly. So I'm not sure that I will be able to cover everything sustainability, climate change and behaviour change in this talk, but I would like to talk to you about a model of behaviour called the Capability, Opportunity and Motivation model, which we have found helpful for understanding behaviour change in lots of different areas, but particularly I'm going to be talking about pro-environmental behaviours today. So just a very quick outline of my talk. First, I'll talk about that model, which is called the combi model of behaviour. I'm then going to give a little bit of an example of how we've used that in one recent research study related to clothing repair and repurpose. I'll then talk about another study to do with active travel and the Street Space for London scheme. And then after that, as Jack's mentioned, there'll be plenty of time, hopefully, for Q&A and discussion. If you do have a question during the talk, I'm happy to sort of stop and answer them, but just bear in mind that it's a little bit difficult for me to see the chat and things while I'm presenting, so I may save them at the end. So we all want people to behave in line with sustainable development. And we can begin by asking ourselves, who must we do what differently? There are a range of different behaviours that we know are needed to kind of meet sustainable development goals, and which have been set out in many different climate change reports and research to date. So that we know that high impact behaviours which need to change are around our diet, our travel, waste, energy consumption, how we interact with and preserve nature, and of course taking a voice and engaging as a citizen on climate change. So we know quite a bit about who must do what differently. But then our next question can be, well, why are people not doing it? This is really kind of where we begin with a lot of different behaviour change problems. So one major factor that we might sort of think about first is knowledge. Do people know what it is that they need to be doing? Do they know about issues to do with climate change? You know, surely if people don't know things, they won't change their behaviour, right? So I would kind of start by posing a little bit of a question, and I quite like to open with this one. Do you think that climate scientists are more likely, the same, or less likely to take flights compared to scientists in other fields? This relates mainly to business flights rather than personal ones. I won't ask you to all sort of respond to do a poll in the chat, but if you want to share your ideas there, please feel free to. But in the interest of time, I'll just give you the answer. And this came from research by the Centre for Climate Action and Social Transformation based at Cardiff University. The answer is climate scientists are actually more likely than other scientists to take flights for research and business trips. And this can be to do with the international nature of their work. So obviously just knowledge alone is not enough to change behaviour. Maybe that's something that you already knew. But then we can start think about concern. So if people are knowledgeable about climate change, you know, does that translate into concern? Well, most people in the UK are concerned about climate change. So this graph is taken from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, who have a sort of attitudes and opinions tracker. And it shows that Most people are very concerned, fairly concerned about climate change. Only a minority are not very concerned, or not at all, or don't know. So yeah, we still know that we're not seeing enough action at fast enough pace to combat climate change. So knowledge, concern don't quite seem to be enough. So what do we need to do to change behaviour? Well, we often quite like to use a bit of a medical analogy to explain the sort of overall process in changing behaviour which underlies much of our work. So firstly, we can understand the symptoms. What's going on with people's current behaviour? Where is it at in relation to the behaviour that we would like to see? Then moving on from symptoms, we have the sort of stage of creating a bit of a diagnosis. So what are the underlying influences on behaviour that explain why people are doing what they're currently doing? Once we can understand those underlying influences, then we can work towards effective treatment. So changing those underlying influences through behaviour change strategies which are really tailored to address them. So most of my talk is going to be about the sort of middle part, the diagnosis. How do we understand what these underlying influences on behaviour could be? And the model I'm going to present is an organising framework for how we could begin to do that. So the combi model, I do normally get people to guess what the COM stand for, but it's really given away in the title of my talk. And the combi model describes 3 necessary conditions that must interact for behaviour to occur. These are capability, motivation, and opportunity. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail next about what each of these different things means. But you could see the combi model as a very simple yet comprehensive way of describing influences on behaviour. There are other more detailed theories of behaviour in psychology and related fields, which perhaps go into more depth in unpacking each of these different areas, particularly, for example, theories of motivation. But combi model could be seen as sort of a really simple one which brings all of those together. So it's not intended to replace all those other theories, but it's one way of kind of seeing how they might all fit into the overall puzzle. So starting first with capability, what sorts of things does this refer to? Well, capability can be broken down further into people's physical capability, so their skills, strength, stamina, for example, and also psychological capability. So this relates to people's knowledge, memory, attention and decision-making processes. In other words, sort of cognitive processes and abilities. So there are these 2 sides to capability, and they both refer to attributes of the individual person. So how capable are you as an individual? Then we have opportunity. So again, we can break this down in 2 different ways. First component is physical opportunity. So this relates to all the different things in a person's physical environment. That could be the built environment, but it also refers to things like time in your day to deal with particular desired behaviour, having resources, including financial resources and money, also locations, where things are placed in the environment around you, physical cues, and so on. So all of these different things are sort of affordances of the physical environment. And there's also social opportunity, and that's the other side of the opportunity domain. So this refers to all different factors going on in somebody's social environment. So interpersonal influences, social norms, models, by which we mean role models, and leadership, and also cultural narratives and practice. So a lot of different factors at play in our social environments too. So then the third component of the combi model, motivation. This is the sort of driving force of behaviour when capability and opportunity are present. And obviously most of us are familiar with the term motivation from everyday life. This can be split again in 2 ways into reflective motivation. And this refers to identities and beliefs, plans and intentions and evaluations. So relatively conscious psychological processes. Also more automatic aspects of motivation, so relatively less conscious processes to some extent. So this could include emotions, impulses, our routines, and habitual processes as well. So that's a bit of a run through of the combi model. I'm just going to give you a little bit more context about that model and how and why it might be useful for changing behaviour. So combi was actually developed from a systematic review of 19 different behaviour change frameworks. This was done a bit over 10 years ago now, so it's possible there could be new ones to add or update to that. But it's by far the most comprehensive at the time. And that review found that many frameworks overlapped, but none were completely comprehensive on their own, and few were linked to any kind of model of behaviour. So combi was therefore developed as the basis of a wider framework, actually, which is called the Behaviour Change Wheel framework. It's shown on the slide. I won't be going into all the details of it today, but there's plenty of information that you can find online about the Behaviour Change Wheel if you want to. And it's starting with this diagnosis, capability, opportunity, and motivation. It provides a framework for then identifying intervention types, which might be the components of an intervention which might be most effective for addressing that part of capability, opportunity, and motivation, and also policy options in the outermost ring for delivering those interventions. So I will be giving a little bit of a flavour of how we use that in the first example I come to. So coming back to what do we need to change behaviour, just a quick recap. You can think about the symptoms, current behaviour and what's going on. Diagnosis, so understanding the underlying influences using the combi model, and then treatment, changing those underlying influences using the behaviour change wheel to design interventions. So the reason I've just recapped that is these correspond to kind of three aims of the next piece of research, which is a bit of an example that I'd like to share with you about extending the lifetime of clothes. So extending the lifetime of clothes saves carbon, water, and waste. It's a really good and important thing to do. And as consumers, repairing and repurposing our clothes can help to keep them in use for longer. So by repair and repurpose, we mean things like mending, altering, upcycling, and repurposing into completely new items that aren't clothes. So that's what this first study was about that I'd like to share with you. In this study, we did a nationally representative survey with 300 participants. And research questions were, how often do people repair and repurpose their clothes? And did COVID impact this? The study was done last year during the pandemic. What are the main barriers and enablers to this behaviour? And what kinds of interventions could increase repair and repurpose? So in terms of the first question, how often do people repair and repurpose? These were the results that we found from our survey. So the majority of people don't repair and repurpose their clothes very often. Be interested to know afterwards if that resonates with people on the call. So most people did this never, about once a year, or about once every 6 months, but very few people did it more often than once every 6 months. So in our research, we also didn't find a significant difference between repairing and repurposing clothes before and during the pandemic. So even though people had a lot more time in lockdown and some people got quite crafty, it seems that this didn't translate into sort of significant difference in this behaviour for our sample. So then we looked at what are the main barriers and enablers to this behaviour, and that was using a battery of about 40 survey items developed especially for the study, and also a free text item which was coded qualitatively to understand people's barriers and enablers, things that we might not have captured through the survey items. So taking those two kinds of data together, these were the main findings that came out from it. So the main barriers included people's skills. They lacked the skills and training to repair and repurpose things well, but also identity. So whereas skills is more of a capability factor, identity relates back to people's motivation to engage in behaviour. So a lack of identity and sense of responsibility over the environmental impacts of clothes was one of the barriers here. Then in green, we have social influences. So people identified that it's not really the norm to do this, right? It's not something you see other people doing a lot. And also in terms of opportunity, on the more physical side, there's the environmental context and resources. So people face time constraints. It's just convenient to buy alternatives, not to repair and repurpose clothes. It's often not always seen as affordable, and some clothes aren't designed to allow for that to be easy. So then what about enablers? What things help people to repair and repurpose? Well, first, in terms of people's capability, was knowledge. So people did have quite good awareness of the environmental impacts. That was something that helped with this behaviour. In terms of people's memory, attention, and decision processes, in case where people have the ability to concentrate and focus on this quite technical task, then that's a really important enabler. On the motivation side, people highlighted beliefs about the consequences. So when people believe that repairing and repurposing will have environmental and economic benefits, that's an enabler to this behaviour. And also emotions, so being attached to your clothing and actually wanting to kind of keep it in use for longer because you really love an item, and be an enabler too. Oh, and the final one was reinforcement, so establishing routines and habits. If you're regularly repairing and repurposing your clothes, then that's something that's more likely to keep you engaging in. So then what kinds of interventions could increase repair and repurpose based on this diagnosis using the combi model? For this, we use the behaviour change wheel to identify some potentially suitable intervention types. So I'll just show you some selected example options here. So one would be perhaps to address the barrier of time constraints and that it's not seen as affordable. An option could be to use the intervention type of environmental restructuring from the behaviour change wheel, and an example of this could be to provide free repair kits at store counters, free community workshops to help with that as well. In terms of this behaviour not being the norm, then the functions of education and persuasion could be useful here. So an example of doing that could be to present fashion influencers explaining the benefits of repair and repurpose, for example. To address the barrier of beliefs about consequences or capitalise on that as an enabler, then you could also use persuasion here to show people images, for example, of textile waste to create negative feelings about buying and disposing of new clothes all the time and engaging with fast fashion. And finally, to address a lack of skills, training could be a suitable intervention option here to, for example, provide online guides, include basic textile skills in the school curricula, and so on. So these are just a few illustrative examples. I'm sorry I don't have a bit more time to kind of go into all the different types of intervention function which are described in the behaviour change wheel, but hopefully there'll be time if you want to go and look away at that afterwards. I'd like to move on to the second piece of research, which we've conducted recently using the combi model in the sort of pro-environmental space. And this was around street space for London. So street space was part of Transport for London, TfL's emergency response to COVID-19. And it provided funding for temporary barriers to widen pavements, new cycle routes, low traffic neighbourhoods, also known as LTNs, and school streets. And all of these different measures are designed partly to help support physical distancing during the pandemic, or at least that was a factor in accelerating their rollout through this funding. So if these new measures which were introduced are successful and maintained, then they could have benefits for health, well-being and economic recovery. So we were really interested in this, whether this could be a sort of possible moment of change. So our main research question in this study was, what are the barriers and facilitators to walking and cycling for short local journeys, which is the focus of these schemes, in places where street space measures have been introduced? So in a sense, this is sort of doing the process a little bit backwards because the intervention has happened already. And then we're interested in what kind of barriers and facilitators that's led to for behaviour. Normally, we might suggest do that the other way around, but this is quite an interesting opportunity for research. So in the study, we worked with two case studies, the boroughs of Lambeth and Hackney in London, and they're marked on the map on that slide there. And we triangulated from two sources of data in this study. So the first was online comments about street space schemes. So we sampled 885 comments, which were made by residents, members of the public on websites where they could leave feedback about these schemes. This is actually quite a small sample in a way. There's probably over 20,000 or so of these comments now. So we just randomly sampled the ones which would provide us with a sort of suitable sample size for research. And to complement that, we also conducted 21 interviews, which were guided by the combi model. So to try to make sure that we covered all of those different possible types of influence on behaviour. And for those, we invited members from local councils, from businesses, schools and families, and community and residents, and with that last group making up most of the participants. So from these two different sources of data, we conducted a qualitative thematic analysis to understand the barriers and enablers to walking and cycling for those local journeys. So we started by doing this separately, by coding the interview data and developing initial themes from the interviews, and also coding the comments and then developing initial themes from those. This was done very inductively. Then from those initial themes, we developed some overall ones reflecting both data sets. And then we categorise each of those themes according to whether they represented a barrier or enabler or a mixed factor. And we mapped them to the combi model. So were they describing an aspect of capability, opportunity, or motivation? So what are the main enablers to walking and cycling for short local journeys? I'll start with those first. So we found 3 different enablers in our research that were clear-cut. One was that new spaces and routes, so creating new segregated cycle lanes and creating things like school streets, which gave people a new sort of area of space for active travel, was definitely something which encouraged them. So that was on the opportunity side. On motivation, the belief that environmental sustainability matters was also something that motivated people to engage in walking and cycling more. And also the health and well-being benefits of active travel, quite widely recognised, and this is an enabler too. In terms of the main barriers, first was related to physical opportunity. So a lack of integration of these new temporary schemes that were brought in during the pandemic with existing infrastructure was seen as something of a problem. Sometimes the schemes would not line up well or seem not to be very well integrated with existing things in the local area. Another opportunity factor was to do with physical accessibility of active travel in general compared to other modes. So recognising that sometimes the support in the environment is not in place for everybody with different accessibility needs to be able to engage easily in active travel, whether that's related to disability or personal circumstances such as having a lot of different people to care for, caring responsibilities, and things like that, or also to do with age and fitness. Another social opportunity factor was around controversy and social division. So this was a really interesting one because these schemes were very divisive, and that itself could be seen as a barrier for their maintenance of people engaging in active travel with them. Similarly, on the motivation side, people were quite dissatisfied with how and why decisions had been taken. Not everybody felt that it had been well communicated, or they clearly understood or had had their views taken into account when these schemes were rolled out. And that perhaps was related to doubt that these schemes actually work as they're intended to. So again, those 2 factors, sort of controversy, dissatisfaction, and doubt, could be more indirect barriers to maintaining lots of walking and cycling in the long term. Then we actually found that around half of the themes from our study were mixed. So that perhaps reflects some of the controversy and division around these schemes. So the mixed factors included changes in local traffic patterns, which related to physical opportunities, so things in the environment. Some people felt that traffic had improved, some felt it got worse, but in any case, it seemed to be a factor that affected people's choice of mode of transport. Other factors included ease and convenience, which differed for different people, and perceptions about how the appeal of the local area had changed. So some people felt that it was nicer and more pleasant to be out walking and cycling, and others less so. People's social roles and identities also play an important part in walking and cycling active travel, and that's widely known from previous research as well. People's feelings about the changes also were important, so whether they were actually ready for any change, and whether the changes seemed sort of sudden and frustrating factor, as could their confidence in their ability to walk or cycle. So how much do people feel like, actually, I'm confident and feel okay to do this? And health, well-being, and environmental values. While everybody values their health and well-being and the environment, different people felt that these schemes were either a good or bad thing for those values. And finally, another really mixed one was that streets felt more or less safe. So safety is a really important factor in people's kind of choice to engage in active travel. And some people felt that these schemes made their streets feel safer. Others actually pointed to the fact they felt less safe, perhaps because fewer cars were around, and so it felt more vulnerable experience to be out and about walking streets. And others felt as well that some of these schemes, because they weren't necessarily well integrated with the existing infrastructure, could make things less safe. So those were the main themes coming out of that piece of research. This really kind of brings me on to wrapping up and giving sort of a bit of a summary and some take-home messages. So these are my take-home points, but I'd be really interested to hear what you've all taken from these pieces of research and from the model and how you might use it. So my first one is just a summary point: to enact any behaviour, capability, opportunity and motivation need to be in place. So knowledge and concern are not enough to change behaviour. We have plenty of evidence of that now. The combi model can be applied with the behaviour change wheel to design interventions which address the underlying causes of behaviour. I hope I've given a bit of a flavour of how that can be carried out in my talk today. And two examples of applying this, so the examples of clothing and active travel that I shared, I think illustrate the complex picture of different influences there are on specific pro-environmental behaviours. So when we're considering an environmental issue, there's likely to be many different influences at play that fall under these headings or domains or categories. And so finally, my kind of take-home message from this is that to meet climate and environmental targets, we really do need more interventions to be guided by theoretical frameworks like these and tailored to particular contexts. I think much of what we do in psychology is often about understanding and developing theories which explain things in general about populations. But when it comes to applying those to particular problems, context can be really important and uncover lots of different factors. So I think we need a process of always exchanging so that we learn from applying theories and use that to update and improve the theories that we use. So that would be kind of my final take-home message from this talk. So I will leave it there and I hope we've got enough time for discussion. And thanks very much to everyone for listening, to all of you. And thanks again for inviting me. And finally, I'd just like to thank the researchers as well who carried out this work. So Lisa Zhang, Oscar Castro, Barilli Neto, and Clara Gerica. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Jo. What an interesting, amazing talk. Really appreciate that. Really enjoyed it myself. I'm sure our guests and people viewing in the audience did as well. Does anyone, you're already receiving claps, there you go. Okay, I was about to say, does anyone have any questions, but Judith has got straight out of the gates and she already has a question for you. So Judith,
straight out of the gate, yes, thanks, Jack.
Yeah. So I'll hand over to you to ask a question.
Thanks, Jo, for a really interesting talk. I'm actually moving into, or in the next few months, starting a project where we're going to be using the combi model and the behaviour change wheel. So it's really interesting and useful to see how you've applied it in your own research. And I just wondered if you had any advice about what you feel about the methodology. What's the best approach to try and explore these elements, the combi elements, in terms of the sort of comparison between doing things like you talked about doing focus groups. You also talked about using surveys. What's your feeling about those methods and what works best? And just from your experience, really interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I have to say that I don't think there would be one particular methodology that I would recommend to be kind of paired up, as it were, with using and applying combi model or other related frameworks of the wider BCW framework and change wheel. There are also others. The theoretical domains framework is a sort of elaboration of the combi model for people who might be less familiar. All of these things, are really flexible tools. So combi is a model of behaviour, just as any other model could be used in flexible ways. Its purpose is to explain in a simplified way behaviour. That's the purpose of any model. So there's not just kind of one set way to investigate capability, opportunity, and motivation. Like I said, in just the two examples that I shared here, we used survey instruments and we also conducted in-depth interviews. Those interviews were guided by the model in terms of the questions that we developed to ask in our sort of flexible interview guide. But then when we were dealing with online comments, we didn't have any of that structuring to that data. It was posed and categorized afterwards. So I would say it really depends on what you would like to find out. I mean, like any piece of research, it depends on the research question, it depends on the resources available. There are plenty of examples of how these tools have been used in quantitative and qualitative research. I would say there's perhaps a richer literature on the qualitative side for some behaviours, but I'm not sure if it's definitely good to say that. But there are also a lot of examples of combi-based questionnaires. So some are there's a validated questionnaire which is quite generic in asking people about the different domains and subdomains of combi. But our approach at UCL has often been to kind of develop more tailored questionnaires for particular behaviours. So to come up with items which kind of reflect what factors are known about in previous literature, for example. So we have some examples related not just to clothing, but also food waste and other sustainability related behaviours. So if you want to, drop me a line afterwards.
I will do. I'll be picking your brains, I expect. Have you done any work, or anyone in your team, with children's behaviours at all? Because our project's going to be looking at children's
Yeah, good question. I haven't personally. Other colleagues have, I'm sure, in the past. So, for example, one colleague of mine is Paul Chadwick, who until recently was the deputy director of our centre and continues to work with us in a different capacity now. And much of his previous work and his career is focused on childhood obesity and kind of factors there. So, I mean, absolutely, these in terms of the combi model, it's not a model only of adult behaviour. For it applies to all ages. So it's just as suitable. I don't really have the kind of experience of using that in research.
So Paul would be somebody to pick. That would be useful for me to sort of pick his brains about.
Yeah, potentially. There's also I'm also aware of a study on kind of active travel in children's routes to school, which uses also, if you're interested in active travel, then that exists.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So next up, Sagar, you had your hand up. You wanted to ask a question?
Hi. Hello, Joe and Jack. Thank you for your insights. My question was with regards to not just clothing. I've been looking at all manner of industries, whether it's building materials, infrastructure is not just about housing, it's about the streets and roads and everything as well. And in terms of my question is more about the general supply chain. And my roots are coming from India and Africa. And I've been quite perturbed by this whole message that's being given out that renewables are fossil fuel free. And when I've gone to speak to people about it, and I says, look, there is an issue of water in India and Africa. Water tables are collapsing. And they says, well, what's this got to do with this? And I says, well, we need to mine the resources, right? Water needs to be used up. So up until that point, people saying, okay, we need to have the resources, we need to have the wind turbines and solar. As soon as I tell them that there's more than likely, not in the urban areas or the city, there's more than likely in the countryside, there's more than likely a community of children or women or both who are encumbered to actually be a part of the mining activity, where the only access they have to water is firstly seeing the water, which is part of their community, part of their soil, being lost because water's lost at a massive rate when mining resources. And then that water is less when they have to drink. So then they have to walk. Whereas in the global north, where we have access to water, when I've posited this scenario to them, then all of a sudden they say, well, we can't solve all the problems, Saga. You're asking too many questions. And my question here is the all of a sudden about face turn in attitudes when we need the water for these renewables versus those people who are they're not the consumers, they're the miners. And they need the water not for mining, but they need the water for themselves, but the water's being taken from them for our privilege. And I've really got a question, which is really to address not the consumer end of the supply chain, which is me in the UK or us in the global north, but those people are so fundamental in the supply chain at the beginning, near the forest, where their livelihoods are, especially in a country like India, which is so many people and is so fundamental to the soil. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I've been quite perturbed by the fact that this message that renewables are fossil fuel free, all this stuff is clean, when I know too well otherwise. And then the other thing is that the water issue is so tantamount now that I have to ask people, okay, let's say your renewables are sustainable. How much water is there going to be left, do you think, for the people in the mines to actually keep on getting those resources? There's going to come a, how do you say, like an inflection point where the water dries up so much. I don't want it to get to that point where it dries up so much that people are probably at this point thinking, well, I need to drink some water, but now there's not any water even for the resources to be mined. And I just need to drink. And I just had a question about that because I feel this is something that's, for some reason, it's been overlooked. It's not looked at properly. I was at the London Stock Exchange yesterday for an event. I was asking them, and some people says, wow, this is like, we didn't know this. So there are people, you know, every day like us who didn't know this. They were not opened to it. But in terms of behavior change, whether it's India, Africa, whether it's another water issue in Yorkshire, like there is every year in the 90s, how should this and can this be addressed? If my question has come across correctly, thank you.
Thanks, Sergey. Yeah, I hope I've followed the gist of your question, and thanks for raising that, because I think those are really important issues. And I confess that I don't think I understand a lot about the situations that you've just been talking about. I think that it's really important in considering behaviour change for sustainability to understand these interconnections and how everyone's behaviour is kind of joined up in systems. So people talk quite a bit about individual change versus systems change in the whole climate debate. I mean, in my view, actually, even when we're talking about systems change, we actually mean the things that people do, but just in collective and organised ways. And so in some of our research at UCL, we're trying to bring kind of systems thinking approaches to the work we do on behaviour and behaviour change for climate and health. And as part of that also, it's really important to hear different people's voices, understand what really is going on. And so we're trying to bring a participatory approach to that as well. So the research that I'm talking about is called the Complex Urban Systems for Sustainability and Health Project, a bit of a mouthful. The acronym is CUSH, which I'll just pop in the chat. And I didn't get really a chance to talk about that today, but these are some of the kind of methods that we're trying to push forward in this sort of space. A use of systems thinking. So we've developed an approach we call behavioural systems mapping, which is about building up systems maps showing how different people's behaviours are connected in different ways, as well as the capability, opportunity and motivation influences on them. So that's one approach. And in doing that, you know, it's like I mentioned, it's really important to kind of bring in different people. And so we're trying to use participatory methods, like holding workshops with lots of different stakeholders, giving people a voice, and systems mapping tools can be a really helpful vehicle for that, because they give a chance for everyone's perspective to be included in that map and see how everything kind of fits together. So that's a very incomplete answer to really important issues, but that's sort of some of our take on it and the directions we're interested in at the moment. Yeah,
just one last thing, because I used to go to a lot of the, it's the irony that the sustainable mining unit of UCL was sponsored by BHP Billiton up until about 3 years ago. And I used to go to that, which was near Euston Station. And I used to ask these questions. For some reason, some people were just like seeing me as a thorn in their side, because I was just like, this doesn't make sense. It closed a few years ago. But then I read BHP Billiton's CSR report a few years ago. I couldn't believe this. They said on the 3rd page or something, they said per mine per day, because, you know, soil is full of water, right? Just like we are. And it said 10 million barrels of water are used up, i.e. extracted per mine per day. Now, I don't know what that means for a village, but that sounds like a lot to me. And I wanted to equip that in for the fact that if I'm explaining to people like you were just also wanting to allude to, then I need to have some figures and actually say, what does 10 million barrels mean? You know, how does it fit into this whole equation? So that's something I'd be interested in your model, whether it's for clothing, food, whatever. So thank you for that. And the other thing, the name you said, Kush, that's very interesting name, but that's another story for another day. Thank you.
Yeah, that name doesn't always translate very well. Thanks for that. And I think we need more thorns in the side, really, you know, if people ask these questions, because with behaviour change interventions, the unintended consequences are just as important, if not more so, to think about than the intended consequences, how to get to those. And that's part of the wider behaviour change wheel framework as well. It comes with the sort of associated steps and pipeline to work through, and part of that is about considering spillover, unintended consequences in the wider context and so on. So yeah, thanks.
Is it on an open source platform, or where would you find it? Because if I wanted to use it for my consulting or to collaborate, how would I use that?
Behaviourchangewheel.com has a lot of information. If you have any trouble getting hold of the materials you need, just drop us a line at Centre for Behaviour Change. We can share lots with you.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Tiger, as well. So just a few more questions that have come in from the chat. So, sorry, 1 second. So this one's from Katie saying, just great talk, Joe. Thank you. Can you say a little bit about any limitations of the combi model?
Yeah, thanks. I actually don't get this question a lot, so that's a really interesting one. Thanks for asking. So as I mentioned before, combi is kind of, it's meant to be a very simple model, which makes it really useful, but that does also mean that there are limitations to how far you could go with this. So capability, opportunity, and motivation are further broken down into those subdomains that I talked about, so the two per main domain. But then beyond those, if you want to get into more detail about kind of known determinants, theoretical determinants of behaviour, so say understand more on the cognitive side of what drives people's, you know, memory, decision and attention processes, for example, or on the social side, the complexities of, you know, our social environments and how those influence behaviour. On the motivation side, dig into kind of more factors around motivation. There's only so far that the combi model itself goes in describing all of those different constructs and including them. What I would say is that it is compatible with many, if not, you know, almost all different kind of theories in psychology, and they sort of fit into those domains somewhere, but it doesn't have the same level of detail as others. So a potentially interesting tool, if you're interested in more detailed theories of behaviour, is that we have put together a database of 76 different theories. There are a lot of different theories of behaviour. That's probably not even all of them in psychology. And so that's searchable, and you can find out what all the different constructs are and the different theories and things. That's one limitation that comes to top of mind about combi, is that it's not the most detailed, but it is designed to be very simple and usable. As for kind of other criticisms and limitations, I actually don't tend to think about those a lot because we use it so much. So if other people have ideas about kind of what has or hasn't worked, particularly if you've use this model and found limitations to it, I'd be really interested to hear. It's always going through, you know, a process of review and update. You know, science is never finished. So yeah, we're really interested in ways that can be improved if there are any.
Awesome. Yeah. Just actually, it got me thinking about something I just quickly like to say, which is that one thing potentially that maybe not a limitation of the model, but a question I would like to ask that I suppose kind of follows on is, do you does the conceptualization of the model have any idea around like the weighting of capability, opportunity, and motivation? So for example, like what is the most important? Obviously I understand that it's about the interaction between the three within the model, but I'd be interested to know if there's any research around whether or not actually, you know, if you've got a location where capability and motivation are high but opportunity is low, is that more detrimental than having high capability and opportunity but low motivation, or, you know, any of the other variations?
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. Sometimes people think of capability and opportunity and motivation kind of like buckets that need to be filled to a certain level for behaviour to occur. I'm not sure, and I think my colleagues might agree, that we're not sure that that's really the best way to think about these things. I think probably the importance, or the kind of relative seeming importance of these factors would vary depending on the behaviour that we're talking about, right? So I mean, I suppose some behaviours require relatively little physical capability to do them, but that very much could depend on the person as well, so we're all different. So it's quite hard to kind of give an answer to that, and I think that relates back to, perhaps that's just a limitation of the model, right, that it's not designed to explain the relative importance of these different factors. That said, I suppose one way to answer your question is about how these factors interact. So combi itself is an interacting system of capability, opportunity, motivation, and behaviour. And so motivation is the part of the model which is the sort of immediate driver of behaviour. So that's one way to think of it, is that when capability and opportunity are in place, then motivation is kind of what determines behaviour, and that's kind of how motivation is defined in a way. So that's one way to look at it, not necessarily to say that motivation is more important, depending on what you mean by important, but that could be one way to answer your question, I suppose. I've got one more question. Okay, firstly, this is just like a more administrative question. Will you be able to share the slides with participants? Yeah, very happy to share slides. Yeah, that's fine.
Great, fantastic. If you email them to me, then I can send them around to all of the people who've signed up. Just some thank yous as well. And then I've got a question coming in here from Natalie. Thanks for a great talk, Joe. Do you have any theories that come to mind that can be used as a framework to understand behaviours that have a negative impact on the environment? I'm curious to better understand the other side of the behavioural coin.
Yeah, that's a good question, Natalie, thanks. You're putting me on the spot a little bit. So it's not really to do with behaviours that have a negative impact on the environment, but I suppose sort of explanatory factors in how and why we kind of don't take so much action on climate change are often described as sort of things to do with sort of distance, so the distance in time and space of the kind of impacts of our actions and of the problem of climate change itself. Often in understanding kind of why do people not do the behaviours that they want and intend to do, we refer to the intention action gap. This is also sometimes elaborated in different ways, so the attitude intention action gap things. As for specific theories and frameworks to understand behaviours that have a negative impact on the environment, I'd have to have a think and get back to you, I think, unless you'd like to elaborate on what sort of negative impact behaviours you're talking about here. So if that's like eating meat or transport behaviours or something like that.
I would be interested to know, Natalie, if you can get back, if you have anything you want to elaborate on that, that would be amazing. I'd be interested to know about the different motivations for behaviour, right? Like you talk about it. So obviously, if you're looking at something like active travel, for example, oftentimes the motivations sometimes the motivations are very different between someone who drives their car and someone who rides their bike, but also often they're very similar. Like the person driving the car says it's convenient and it's faster, and then the person riding the bike goes, it's convenient and it's faster. So there must be something beyond just the concepts of motivation. And I know you talk about how it's not a comprehensive model, it's a practical and it's a holistic sort of model, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I guess, and perhaps it answers Natalie's question a little bit as well. Sort of theories which might help explain what you're talking about are related to values. So Linda Stegg, who is an environmental psychologist at Groningen University, she and her colleagues over past decade or so have developed theories and models around people's values, and one way that she organises those is into 4 different types. I hope I can get them right. So you have biospheric values, which relate to kind of caring about the world, hedonic values, which relate to kind of caring about our own comfort and pleasure. Then there's values related more to our own personal resources, so in kind of economic gain and things like that. And then there's values related to other people, so sort of more altruistic values and caring about, about others. So these are examples of the sort of values that we all hold. Everyone to some degree, on the whole thinks that these things are important. But part of values theory is about suggesting that these are general motivators of behaviour. So they almost sit a bit outside or beyond the kind of motivation factor in the combi model. And that could perhaps be kind of one helpful way to understand, well, why do people engage in different things at different times? Sometimes these values are described as coming to the fore more for people than some others, and also in more situations than some others. So it could be that in a given time and place, then your value to kind of have comfort and pleasure in life is just much more stronger and kind of overriding compared to your altruistic values or your biospheric values to care about the planet. So I think that is one helpful theory and framework that can be a useful way to understand why people don't always engage in sort of pro-environmental behaviour, even though at one level we kind of all agree that these different things are important. It's about them coming to the fore in different ways for different people or in different situations.
And if anyone in the audience is interested in more about values and climate action, we did actually have Tej Bauman, who is from the University of Groningen and does all that kind of research, giving a P-talk a few months ago. So where this is on the YouTube, you will also be able to find that talk as well. Natalie's responded saying, perhaps some kind of moral disengagement argument. I will have a think. Yes, values related theories sound like what I'm getting at. So thank you there.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. And sorry, just to add that, yeah, moral discounting is described as that's one way of explaining some of those negative behaviours. So it sort of refers to the effect where maybe you've used a reusable coffee cup that morning, so you think, oh, it's completely fine if I then book that flight. So yeah, these sorts of discounting or compensatory effects can happen.
Yeah, that raises something that I know that we have a master's student here who's doing research about this, and it relates to kind of what you're saying. Is that, do you think that there is, or are you aware of any, well, I don't know how to say it. The idea, do you come across any experience where people, for example, say they ride their bike, therefore they consider themselves green, and they kind of use some environmental behaviour to justify other non-environmental behaviors? So for example, with your climate scientists, well, they're the ones who are doing all the research, so shouldn't they be allowed to go on more flights? You see what I mean? Like, is there a kind of trade-off there that occurs? And even when you're doing something that's not necessarily sustainable, it's just more sustainable, does that make you then feel that you can do other less sustainable things? I don't know if you're aware of any research on that.
Yeah, so I probably wouldn't be able to summarize it well off the top of my head, but there is definitely a body of research on the sort of spillover of environmental behaviours that finds quite a lot of mixed evidence for whether there is like desirable spillover of doing one behaviour to another or not. And like you said in those examples, there can be times when engaging in pro-environmental behaviour means that you might do less of another one, or you might do more of another one. And I would expect that identity and kind of people's to what extent people consider themselves to be pro-environmental plays a factor in that, for better or worse. So it's quite interesting that, in our street space study, people pointed to identity as an important factor in kind of walking and cycling, and particularly it's known to be a factor in cycling, which is associated with a lot of stereotypes. And it's interesting because although our research didn't point to this, I'm just kind of speculating now, I think people's identities could be, well, I engage in cycling because I'm a pro-environmental person and I care about carbon emissions. It could be that people go, well, I really care about my health and fitness, or I really care about, saving my money for the important things in life. So again, that kind of comes back to values. There can be lots of different ways that our values are linked to our identities and how those play out in behaviour. So yeah, it's probably quite a complex one, doesn't have easy answers, but there is definitely a body of research about how those things affect spillover of pro-environmental behaviours.
And just one last really quick question, because we're about to run out of time, is do you have any knowledge about any research around kind of applying kind of interventions, nudges, behavioral change in within a neighborhood? Like if you have, say, for example, one member of a community or neighborhood who's very interested in trying to improve the sustainability of their neighborhood, if you've got any knowledge or research around how that, the kind of things they might be able to do to influence the people who live on their street or within their residential area or something like that.
Yeah, interesting question. I can't think of kind of studies that come to mind of like the influence of specific individuals, although I'm sure this must have been studied, you know, as kind of climate influencers, as it were, or sustainability influencers or something. I think probably a lot of different fields of study could come into play here. So I mean, as for what those people could do, you know, there's a lot about kind of like climate action research, speaks of lots of different kind of grassroots initiatives and how successful different ones have been, and which could be suitable for, you know, like a university setting or a home neighbourhood setting or a school setting or others. So there's lots of stuff on that. I mean, I think probably research on kind of social networks and network analysis and the influence of individuals on others would be really interesting, and also kind of research on use of social norms, so like descriptive norms about how many people are doing a certain thing, and injunctive norms about how desirable that behaviour is to do. There's obviously been quite a lot of behavioural insights work on kind of using norms to influence other people, and there are famous examples from tax and others from the behavioural insights team. But yeah, so sort of research on social norms and how those have been used as well would be interesting there. So I think it's probably a question that's been come at from several different angles. But so that's, I think, why it's hard to just sort of think of one, you know, one particular finding there.
So one question from Sagar is, what's the combi website address? And there you go, you're right ahead of the game there, Joe. And then also a nice comment about interrogate the public, serving politicians, not the scientists. So maybe we shouldn't be calling you out on for environmental behaviour related research. We should be taking it to the people who make the decisions, because you're doing wonderful work, Joe. So on that note, I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much for coming. This has been a really interesting talk. You know, you actually, this we had our highest sign-up rate so far of any P talk, so you're popular amongst the climate activists of Durham and the wider community, and of the nation. So thank you so much again, I guess, really, and thank you to everyone for coming and for your interesting questions. And I'm sure if you go look in the chat now, you'll find lots of appreciation for your talk. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Jack, and thanks everyone. It's been a real pleasure, and more than happy to follow up if anyone would like to ask questions or drop us a line afterwards. Thank you.